Hi, Danny Frank here, and I'm with Dr. Mariko Silver, the relatively new president of Bennington College. The 10th president in Bennington College's 82-year history, right? And Dr. Silver, thank you for being with us, and your background information describes how prior to Bennington, you were a key strategist in one of the most radical designs in higher learning since the origin of the modern university. I mean, that sounds so profound, but I believe that that was the way Newsweek magazine described it in terms of your work at Arizona State University. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here on GNAT and to be talking to the communities here in Vermont. So a little bit about Arizona State University. So those are Newsweek's words, not mine, but we are very proud of what continues to be going on at Arizona State University. The president there, Michael Crow, is a mentor of mine. He has a very strong commitment to the public aspect of being a public university. So if you think across the country, whether we're thinking about here in Vermont, but really looking across the landscape of higher education, you'll see that many public universities have not stayed as true, and UVM is an exception in this case, but have not stayed as true to their public mission and the access part of their public mission as was originally envisioned. And really what Michael set out to do was to do what some other countries have done quite well, which is to ensure that we were designing an institution, redesigning an institution, so that it could be both large and excellent, so that it could focus on access and focus on extraordinary productivity. And these are things that are, in our American way of thinking about higher education, often thought to be at odds. We can get into the history of why that's true, but even if you think about something that many people are familiar with, like the U.S. News and World Report rankings, a big piece of what goes into that is a ranking of your selectivity. Right. So the idea is that you, let's say 100 students apply, you only accept 20 of those students. You are a better institution by that measure than if 100 students apply and you accept 50 or 70 of those students. Well, Michael really turned that on its head. And the way we wanted to look at it was instead, rather than looking at the status of the institution based on who you exclude, look at the status of the institution based on who you include. Because the real measure of the success and the value of an educational institution should be about what happens to the students when they're there. In other words, how much have they gotten out of their experience there? How much better off are they when they left than when they came in? Rather than looking at whether or not we got the cream of the crop coming in, the question is whether we are sending the cream of the crop out the other end of their educational experience. And if you look at it in a national scale, what you'll see is that in the top economic quintile in the United States, so the top 1/5 of families by earnings and by economic assets, if you look at them, you'll see that roughly 80% of the children of those families will go to college, graduate from college, go out into the world with a college degree. If you look at the bottom quintile, you will see a very different story. And what ASU is committed to, and from a different angle, what Bennington is committed to, is ensuring that part of what happens in education is an evening out of opportunity across economic quintiles. And that's a very different way of approaching that as the fundamental driver of your institution, while also committing to interdisciplinary research and teaching, while also committing to focusing the research that you do within the institution, not only on what we call in the higher ed biz, what we call blue sky research, but really focusing also on things that are going to have a real impact on society. Taking questions of society and looking at them through a research lens in a higher education institution with the objective of helping to find pathways to solutions.
Well, what motivated you to choose Bennington College as the next progression of your academic pursuits, which has included work at Columbia University, study at Yale, University of Sussex in the UK and the University of California. I mean, these are all large institutions, and little Bennington, what was the motivation there?
Yeah. Well, these decisions are always some part personal, there's some part professional, and there's some part sort of, magic, right? There's the art and the science. So on the personal side, I have 2 small children. Moving to Bennington, to North Bennington, we actually, I guess technically we live in Shaftesbury, but living in this community was incredibly appealing for us. It's very important to me that my kids grow up with experience in the outdoors, that they're comfortable being outside, and that they're physical, and that they have a real experience of understanding the relationship between the land and their food, that they have a real understanding of the relationship between humans and animals, that they have a real understanding of the relationship within a community. Now, New York is a terrific place, Phoenix is a terrific place. I grew up in a big metropolitan area. I'm not against that, but particularly to me, in the first years of their lives, I wanted them to have this outdoor, fresh air, tight community experience. And it's been incredibly rewarding for me as their mother to watch them flourish in this environment in very different ways than I'm sure they would if we lived in a big city. So from a personal point of view, there's that aspect of it, and it's just a wonderful part of the world. I've traveled to over 50 countries, and this is the part of the world that we wanted to be in.
That's an endorsement for Vermont.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, it's a wonderful place, and has a wonderful spirit and energy about it, in addition to the physical beauty, and a great sense of community. So we're very excited about that part of it. But that's not what you were asking me. So there's that piece. But in terms of the professional question of why would I come to Bennington College, why would I come to a small liberal arts college that's a private institution, when a lot of my commitment of my working life has been to public institutions of various kinds. So to my mind, one of the great benefits of the United States higher education landscape is its diversity. Look around any small community, any big city, let alone look across the entire United States or across the world, what you see are all different kinds of minds, all different brands of brilliance, all different kinds of talents, and all different kinds of ways of moving about in the world. And to me, what we have in the United States is a great platform for encouraging all of those talents, all of those capabilities to their fullest extent within higher education. What I also see is that in the past, you can pick your time frame, let's say 10, 20 years, we've seen too much flattening out of what that means. Everyone has one idea of what it is to be great. This is why being at ASU was so exciting for me. Back to our earlier piece of our conversation, I love to see what we can do, and it was amazing to watch students who maybe wouldn't fit into the box of what we say is, you're qualified for higher ed, or you're going to succeed in a classroom, to watch students who come from all different walks of life with all different kinds of brilliance really find themselves and flourish and go out into the world where they are going to be major forces, whether they're social or economic, people, whether it's starting what turn out to be giant businesses, or it's changing the world through advocacy, to watch that happen at ASU. And one of the things when I look across the landscape of higher ed in the US is I see that the diversity is being diminished, because everybody has this one idea, whether it's US News or whatever else your measure is, of what it is to be a good place to study. What was appealing to me about Bennington, and what continues to be appealing to me about Bennington, is that it was designed from the very start as a lab for a different kind of education. And the difference is not about necessarily even content or quality, it's about approach. So it's about pedagogy, as we say in higher ed. It's about the way we think about the human mind. And when I see what students who graduate from Bennington are able to do, I am floored. And some of them are traditional students, straight A students in high school, great SAT scores, done every activity, or were the captain of this team and the head of that club, and saved the animals and saved the children and all of these things. Some of them are exactly those kids. And some of them are the kids who have all of that in them, but maybe the school environment they were in wasn't right for them, because they are a brilliant artist and nobody recognized that. or a brilliant novelist. So this year alone, 2 of our graduates won Pulitzer Prizes.
Really?
2 of our graduates won Pulitzer Prizes in literature. 2 out of 7. 2 out of 7 Pulitzer Prizes. And I mean, that just shows you what Bennington students go on to do. Meanwhile, we had a student who won one of the most prestigious journalism prizes, a recent graduate. Graduated in 2005 for a long-form piece he did in the New York Times Magazine about the Christmas Island boat lift. We have students who go on to be doctors and lawyers and all of the things you think about when maybe as a parent you think, what can my kid go on to do after higher education, and go on to have incredibly successful lives. But they do it from a variety of perspectives, and what we do at Bennington is really focus on the individual student and working with them to figure out how they can set their genius free.
Well, some of the distinguished alumnus that I am familiar with, Betty Ford, the former First Lady, I remember when she passed away a couple of years ago, there was a lot of coverage about her time spent at Bennington College. And Carol Channing, the actress, who's very elderly but still with us, she's a Bennington graduate, and Tim Daly, a major television star and in movies. I'm sure there are many other prominent and distinguished alumni, right?
There are. So, as I mentioned, Donna Tartt and Megan Marshall. Donna Tartt won the Pulitzer this year for her book, The Goldfinch. Megan Marshall won the Pulitzer for biography, and for her biography of Margaret Fuller. Michael Pollan, who those of you who are foodies out there would probably know Michael Pollan's work, both as a journalist and as an author of books. Those who are in the higher ed sphere might know Mark Edmondson, who writes wonderful essays about how to read well and how to teach well. And that's just literature. Kiran Desai, who was the youngest person ever to win the Man Booker Prize, is one of our graduates. Luke Mogelson is the person I mentioned earlier who wrote the story in the New York Times on the Christmas Island boat lift. That's just the writers. Helen Frankenthaler, one of the lions of the abstract art movement in the United States, is an alum. And I don't know, how long do we have for me to, to list?
So, Dr. Silver, I visited the campus of Bennington a few times over the years, and certainly it enjoys a national, even global reputation. People know or have heard about Bennington College wherever you go. And to that degree, I'm struck by the relatively small student body and the emphasis on, when you walk around the campus, look at the buildings, meet the faculty, the fundamentals of teaching, mentoring, one-on-one education, traditional classrooms, without all of the bells and whistles or the exotic features that seem to take place at college campuses today. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. We're focused on the core elements. So we have a rock climbing wall. That's great. That's not what we sell to our students. That's not what we talk about when we're talking to prospective students. And that's not what our students talk about when you talk to them. They talk about the work. And when they talk about the work, they're not talking about homework. They're talking about the work that they do, the work that they are driven to do. And one of the things that was so, back to your earlier question about what drew me to Bennington, when I started really digging in and doing my research, what I saw was Bennington has an extraordinarily outsized impact for its size. In what its graduates go on to do, in what its pedagogical model has pushed out into the world, and who its faculty are. I mean, W.H. Auden, Peter Drucker was a faculty member, and now we have Liz Deschennes, who's an extraordinary photography faculty member whose work is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney in New York, and she's about to have a show at the Walker Art Center. The head of the LA Philharmonic is an alum. One of the major curators at the Museum of Modern Art is an alum. The director of the Bronx Museum is an alum, and on and on and on. So when you think about what is it about the educational experience that allows such a small school to have such an extraordinarily outsized impact for its alumni body and for its faculty size? And I think the answer really is in the culture that thrives there because of the intimacy, because of the integrated nature of teaching and learning, because of the mutual respect that's built and the collaborative nature of the work students do at Bennington. And that is due in no small part to the intense focus on individual interest and how we scaffold individual interests and scaffold an education for each individual student. There was a Gallup poll that came out recently looking at what are the biggest predictors of lifetime fulfillment in work, right? So both employment, how much money you make over your lifetime, all of those things, and layering over that fulfillment. How much do you love your work? How much does it make you happy? It's what we do, most of us do with the majority of our day. If you hate your work, you might not love your life, right?
Sure.
And so how do we think about that? How do we think about that as higher education institutions? What Gallup found, which is as good data out there as any, Gallup, as I'm sure you know, does extraordinary work. And what they found is that connection between a student and a mentor in their higher education experience. So while in college, your sense of connection with a particular faculty member, better yet, more than one, that is the single biggest determinant of fulfillment in your work later on in life and success in your work later on in life.
Dr. Silva, your past work actually includes several years as the title is an acting assistant secretary for international affairs and a deputy assistant secretary for international policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So with that being said, how did your academic career prepare you for such a different role?
Mm-hmm. Rolls right off the tongue, right, that title? But you can imagine my business card. It was like full of lettering, and then it was Chinese on the other side. So in terms of my academic career, I drew on, when I worked at Homeland Security, I drew on everything I knew. So I drew on my study of and experience in big organizations, because one of the things, there's the mission part of Homeland Security, and what I was in charge of and overseeing was our relationships with other governments. And so I worked very heavily with the State Department and the White House, and then worked very heavily with our counterparts in other governments to do things like align our identity standards, to align our airport security, to align our cargo security, things like that, because we can't wait until things land in the U.S. to figure out whether they're dangerous or not. We really want to do as much of that overseas with partnership as possible. We want them to be safe as well, so we want them, to the extent possible, to align their standards with ours, and where their standards are better, for us to align our standards with theirs. So I really drew, so that's the mission piece, but there's also the management piece of what happens at Homeland Security. So it's the newest federal government agency, as most people know, federal government department, and it's made up of multiple, more than 20 different disparate parts that came.
Units,
some came
sure.
Right. Some came from used to be in the Treasury Department. Some used to be in the Department of Justice. Some used to be, so they were scattered all over. So if you think about Secret Service, protects the president and cabinet members and foreign dignitaries. They were part of Homeland Security when I was there. Before that, they were part of the Treasury Department. Same goes for Customs and so on and so forth. So when you create a new entity out of a whole bunch of disparate parts, you essentially have a merger, and managing through a merger is no small task. You have to change culture. You have to be respectful of the cultures that you're bringing in, but understand when they don't mesh together, figure out how to shift them over time. So when you talk about things like the transformation of Arizona State University, and you ask me sort of how hard is it to turn the ship, it's much harder to turn the Homeland Security ship than it is to turn the ASU ship, but a lot of it is the same kinds of skills and the same kinds of really listening to people about what works and doesn't work for them, and then bringing them to the table to talk about how they can find a way forward together. It's fundamentally, it's institution building, it's diplomacy, and it is a set of analytical capabilities that I really learned, I learned through doing in my work in academic institutions, but I also learned in school in some fundamental way by studying others who have done it.
So now let's twist it around again. The several years you spent at Homeland Security, does that experience and perspective, what does that bring to your latest work and vocation at Bennington?
So a couple of things. One is I did a lot of hiring and assessment of skills, and looking at and bringing these multiple agencies together under DHS, what different kinds of training bring to the table in different kinds of environments. So I always looked at my Homeland Security experience when I was dealing with personnel issues, of which there were many, many, through the lens, obviously, of Homeland Security and what the institution needed, but also through the lens of what are these people bringing to the table? How can we elevate their best capabilities? How do we create structures to do that? And fundamentally, that's what education is about. So I bring that experience of seeing it out in the world in that way, how people apply the experiences that they have in these critical developmental years of college. How do they apply them against some of our thorniest problems in the world? You know, how does that change? How does their educational experience change the way they think about Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS, and really understanding what analytical capabilities are useful in what situations on the ground? In addition to that, I really got, while I'd done a lot of international work at ASU and for the state of Arizona, I got a very different view, as you might imagine, coming out of Washington, D.C. and working with the State Department, working with all of the embassies that are represented in Washington, and traveling to over 50 countries to really work with them in a roll-up-your-sleeves way about things that are vitally important to both of us, and things that have the weight of, particularly in democratic countries, the weight of the populace behind them or not. Right? And how do you work through those kinds of incredibly complex problem-solving experiences? And I bring that both as an educator directly teaching students now, but also I bring that experience of seeing multiple different ways of looking at a problem and different lenses for looking at what feels on paper like the same problem. And fundamentally, that is what I think one of the great attributes of Bennington and a Bennington education is and can be, which is that every Bennington student gets those multiple lenses, both from their fellow students and from the incredible array of faculty we have and the range of classes they get to take. So even if you come into Bennington and you want to be an environmental scientist, you're going to take your environmental science classes, but you are going to take an incredibly broad range. You know, you're probably going to take, sculpture. You're probably going to take filmmaking. You're probably going to take poetry, even as you take your environmental science classes, which is going to give you a totally different way of thinking about how to move the needle in environmental science. So if you think about, for example, whatever you think about the current state of the environmental movement in the United States, Silent Spring was an incredible motivator of the environmental movement. And it was, while it was analytical, on some fundamental level, it was a piece of literature. And that's a very different way of thinking about what motivates people. Because if you want to motivate people to make change, so you can have all, as we see, you can have all the science you want. If people are not emotionally motivated to make change, they're probably not going to do it. And so you have to link up the science and the emotion. You have to link up what moves people to action with what they know perhaps the action should be. Right? And liking something on Facebook is not the same. And you're not moved in the same way by a Facebook campaign probably as you are by reading an incredibly well-written piece of, maybe poetry isn't your thing, but an incredibly well-written piece in the New York Times. It's a very different emotional experience, and understanding that, being able to understand that both as a writer, as a scientist, from the psychological point of view, that gives you a whole different kind of toolkit when you go out in the world.
Dr. Silva, we have about another minute, but I wanted to ask you before we conclude here about the crisis in higher education, the cost factor, the level of student debt, the tuition, the fees, the expenses continue to climb. They seem to be much faster than the rate of inflation, and we see students graduating or even dropping out with $25,000 to $50,000 of student debt. And your take, where are we going with this?
Give me 1 minute to answer.
Yeah, no. And was there a time in history of American education where maybe there was a similar, comparable circumstance?
Well, I'll take the last part first, but just just to say, I think a lot of those numbers are, while incredibly important and we all need to be paying attention to them, they're national numbers. And if you think about the variety in income, in commitment to education, and types of educational institutions throughout the United States, you will immediately see that the experience of someone at Bennington versus the experience of someone at, let's say, Corinthian colleges, which is now going to probably close down. Right. Federal government has revoked their money because of bad practices in terms of financial aid. I mean, those numbers include bad actors like that, together with places like Yale and Harvard and Bennington, where north of 70 to, and sometimes some classes 90% of our students get significant institutional aid. So it's a little bit apples and oranges, and we could have a whole show on that.
Sure.
But to your last point, I think we have in the past faced these moments of real decision after World War II with the GI Bill, but we had the GI Bill.
Sure.
Right? And so the real difference at this moment is that we don't have the federal government stepping up. Now, believe what you know, everyone has different opinions. I mean, throw a stone, you're going to find someone with a different opinion about how much the federal government should do and where and how much taxpayer money and so on and so forth. But you can also look at the history and see the fundamental difference in our entire economic situation, and taking this small but vitally important slice on higher education, what the inaction in Congress and the inability to act in Washington around things like changing the way that student loan recipients are able to pay down their debt, right? So there's all this coverage now. You can refinance your house. You can probably refinance your car. It's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to refinance your student loan debt to a lower interest rate. That's crazy. And that's a federal policy question. So I think the difference now in looking at some of these numbers is both the entry of the for-profit higher education, and it's not that that's all bad. It's just that whenever you have a big shift in a sector, you're going to see a lot of confusion and complication, both on the financial side and on the quality of product side. And you see this inaction at the federal level, starting with the Morrill Act in the 1800s and the establishment of all the land-grant colleges, including UVM. You had a very different sense of the national obligation to higher education. What we've seen in the last 15 years or so is a real pulling out of the rug from under state institutions, public institutions. This has created a ripple effect. And as I said, we can have a whole other show on this. Has created a ripple effect within higher education around what the revenue models are. And it's negatively impacting students. So a big piece of the difference maker here is the role of government.
Dr. Mariko Silva, 10th president of Bennington College, thank you for being with us, and come back again.
Thank you for having me.
So this is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.